She was standing in the kitchen doorway when I came home that evening, holding a mug in both hands, steam rising slowly into the air between us. Her eyes found mine the second I walked through the door. Not searching. Already decided. She crossed the room in 3 steps, set the mug down on the counter behind me, and before I could say a word, she pressed her lips against mine. Brief, deliberate, completely certain. I stood very still. Through the thin wall between the kitchen and the living room, I could hear the television still running, the sound of a news anchor reading something I couldn't make out. My roommate had just kissed me, and somehow, what I felt wasn't confusion. It was recognition. Like something I had quietly known for a long time had finally decided to stop waiting. To understand how we got there, I have to go back to the beginning. My name is Owen. I'm 33 years old. I work as a landscape architect for a mid-sized firm in Seattle, Washington, the kind of job that sounds creative until you explain how much of it is actually municipal permits and drainage calculations. I bought into a 2-bedroom apartment share 3 years ago with a woman named Priya. We'd been together for 2 years before that. Moving in together was the kind of decision that felt like progress at the time, the next logical checkpoint on a map someone else had drawn, and I'd been following without asking where it led. Priya left 16 months before that evening in the kitchen. She didn't leave loudly. That wasn't her way. She'd been packing her things slowly for weeks, a little at a time, and one afternoon she sat across from me at the dining table, folded her hands together, and said, "Owen, I think we both already know this is over." I nodded. I think I said something like, "Yeah." We finished our tea. Then she took the last of her boxes, and that was that. I put up the room listing 2 weeks later. I told myself it was purely financial. I didn't let myself think too long about the way the apartment had changed after she left, the way certain silences had started to feel less like quiet and more like absence with a shape to it. The apartment itself had personality by then. Old floors that creaked in specific spots I'd learned to navigate without thinking. A window in the hallway that never quite sealed right and let in a thin ribbon of cold air every winter that I'd patched twice and given up on. A long, narrow bookshelf in the living room that leaned 2 degrees to the right and which I'd shimmed with a folded piece of cardboard that had been there so long it had become part of the furniture. Out of everyone who responded to the listing, most of them wanted to negotiate before they'd even seen the place. One person asked if I had a parking space before asking about the room itself. The one who became my roommate sent a message that said 3 things. She worked from home, she kept late hours, and could I tell her about the neighborhood's access to green space? No preamble, no positioning, just the things she actually cared about knowing. I wrote back the same way. She took the room. Her name was Mara Sinclair, 29 years old, freelance writer, and occasional researcher for a couple of online publications, the kind of work that sounds unstable to people who don't understand it and makes complete sense to the people who do it. She'd grown up in New Hampshire, come to Seattle 18 months before, and had been moving through the city quietly, building a life out of small, deliberate choices. She moved in with a standing desk she assembled herself, a French press she treated with the kind of care most people reserve for fragile things, and a cardboard box of postcards from places she'd never been, sent to her over the years by people she clearly loved. She pinned exactly none of them to the wall. They stayed in the box. That detail stayed with me. It was the detail of someone who wasn't sure yet how long she was staying. We settled into a rhythm quickly. Our schedules barely overlapped. I left early, she started working late, and by the time I came home most evenings, she was deep in something at her desk, and the apartment smelled like coffee and whatever she'd made herself for dinner, usually something that involved a cast iron pan and more garlic than strictly necessary. We crossed paths in the kitchen, morning, sometimes night. We didn't fill the silence with effort. We just existed in the same space without requiring anything of each other. And that, I noticed early on, was rarer than it should have been. Then came the Tuesday night, about 3 months in, when she walked into the kitchen while I was reading at the table and stood at the counter for a long moment before she said anything. She was holding her phone, not looking at it. Looking at me instead. Her parents were coming to Seattle. They were arriving Thursday. That was 2 days away. And she had made a specific kind of error that I was about to learn the full shape of. Mara's parents were Thomas and Claire Sinclair. Thomas was a recently retired civil engineer from Connecticut. Claire taught high school English and had, by all accounts, very specific ideas about what her daughter's life was supposed to look like by now. They weren't unkind people, Mara told me later that night, sitting at the kitchen table while I made tea neither of us had asked for, but which I made anyway because it gave me something to do with my hands. They loved her. That was actually the problem. They loved her in the particular way that makes love feel like a deadline. She had been with someone named Elliot for 2.5 years. When it ended, Elliot had walked away cleanly and explained it by saying he didn't feel ready for the life she was describing. What he meant, and what Mara had taken a long time to understand, was that he had never intended to be in that life at all. He had let her believe otherwise because it was easier than the conversation it would have required. After Elliot, every call home with her parents had an undercurrent. Her mother mentioned her cousin's engagement. Her father asked careful leading questions about whether she was meeting people. She had gotten good at deflecting, but deflection had a cost, and one evening 3 months ago, tired and worn down, and without the energy to do it one more time, she had told her father she was seeing someone. There was no one. "I panicked," she said, looking at her hands around her mug. "I told him it was serious, and then I spent 3 months hoping they wouldn't visit." Her father had visited before, but Claire, her mother, had always stayed home. This time they were both coming. This time her father had said he wanted to meet him. I asked if she wanted me to help. I'm not sure why I phrased it as a question. I think I already knew the answer before she'd finished explaining. She looked at me the way you look at someone when you're not sure if you're asking too much. "If you don't want to, just say so," she said. "I'll figure something else out." I noticed the way she'd built the refusal into the offer before I'd had a chance to respond, like she was already protecting herself from the answer she expected. I told her I'd help. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "Okay, but we should probably get our story straight." We spent the next 2 hours at the kitchen table going over it. She'd made a list on the back of a piece of mail, not a legal pad, not a notebook. The back of an envelope from her electric bill, the handwriting small and careful in a way that made me think she was someone who took notes seriously, even when she was pretending she wasn't doing anything formal. How did we meet? We'd been sharing the apartment before we started dating, which was true. We just had to make the timeline make sense. How long had we been together? We agreed on 4 months. 4 months was close enough to our actual dynamic that we wouldn't have to manufacture too much. What did we do together? We thought through the small things, the Saturday morning coffee routine, the walk we'd taken along the water once when neither of us had anything else to do, the film we'd both watched separately and then talked about from our respective ends of the couch. These things had happened. We were just reclassifying them. "You're good at this," she said at one point. "At what?" "Making things feel real." I didn't answer that. I just moved on to the next question on the envelope. Her parents arrived on a Thursday morning while I was at work. By the time I got home, Mara had cleaned the apartment with the kind of thoroughness that meant she was nervous, and Thomas and Claire Sinclair were sitting on the living room couch, looking at the framed map on the wall above the bookshelf the way people look at things when they're trying to understand the person who chose them. Thomas stood when I walked in. He was tall, precise in his movements, the kind of man who had probably been described as steady his entire life. He shook my hand. His grip was firm and even, no performance to it. Claire was warmer. She smiled before I'd done anything to earn it and said she'd heard good things, which I knew meant she'd heard very little and was giving us the benefit of the doubt. We had dinner that night, the 4 of us, in a restaurant Mara had chosen carefully, quiet enough to have a real conversation, not so quiet that silence would feel like failure. I sat across from Thomas. Mara sat across from Claire. At some point in the first hour, something shifted. I don't know exactly when. Thomas asked me about my work, the real version, not the version people ask about at parties. He asked about the technical side, the challenge of making designed space feel undesigned, the problem of water management in urban greening projects. I gave him the real answers, the ones that aren't performance, the ones I give when someone asks a question they actually want the answer to. He nodded when I finished. Then he said, "Mara talks about how you explain things." He said it simply, like it was just information. I looked at her. She was watching her mother say something, but the slight tension in her shoulders said she'd heard every word. Claire asked us how we'd gotten together. Mara told the version we'd agreed on, and I listened. And when she got to the part where I'd started making her coffee in the mornings, just because I happened to be up first, I realized that was something I actually did. I had simply never thought about what it meant. The evening went well. Thomas laughed twice, genuinely, at things I said without trying to be funny. Claire touched Mara's hand across the table when they talked about something I didn't catch, and Mara's shoulders came down a little. On the walk back to the apartment, the four of us moving through the damp Seattle evening, Thomas fell into step beside me and said, "You seem like you mean it." I asked what he meant. He said, "When you talk about things that matter to you, you seem like you mean it." Then he said good night and walked ahead. I didn't say anything to Mara about that until much later. They went back to their hotel. We came home to an apartment that smelled like the garlic bread she'd made the night before, and the particular quiet that settles after you've been holding something carefully for hours and can finally put it down. She sat on the couch. I made tea. We didn't talk about it for a while. Then she said, "That went better than it had any right to." I handed her the mug. "Your dad's a pretty precise thinker," I said. "Yeah," she said. "He liked you." I sat down at the other end of the couch. She was looking at the map on the wall. After a moment, she said, "Thank you, Owen." I told her she didn't need to thank me. She said she knew, but she wanted to anyway. The morning after her parents flew home, the apartment went back to what it had been. She was at her desk by 8. I left for work. But something had shifted very slightly in the way the space felt, the way it felt when we passed each other in the kitchen, the way she would glance up from her screen when I came in and then back down without needing anything from me. I had always noticed her. I just hadn't been paying close attention to the fact that I was noticing. It started small. The way she got stuck on a problem, she'd go very quiet, stiller than usual, and then a few minutes later she'd type something very fast like the answer had arrived all at once. The way she'd leave a book face down on the couch arm when she went to get water and come back and pick it up exactly where she'd left it without losing the thread. The way she sometimes said goodnight twice, once from her room and once a few minutes later when she realized she'd forgotten something in the kitchen, the second one softer, almost to herself. I didn't try to analyze any of it while it was happening. I just let it accumulate, the way things do when you're not trying to make them into anything yet. The way things do when something honest is building itself out of the materials that are already there. There was a night in February when the power went out for 4 hours in the middle of a storm. We'd both been in our rooms. We ended up in the kitchen by default, the same idea occurring to us simultaneously. And then we sat on opposite sides of the kitchen table with candles between us and talked for 3 hours. Not the way people talk to fill silence. The way people talk when the lights are out and neither of you is going anywhere, and the conversation has nowhere to go, but somewhere real. She told me about the postcard collection. Each one had come from someone who'd been trying to show her something, she said. Her college roommate from a city she'd always meant to visit. Her brother from a country he'd gone to for 6 weeks and stayed in for 2 years. An ex-boyfriend from a beach town he'd been passing through. She'd never pinned any of them up because she wasn't sure yet what to do with all that evidence of people she cared about moving through the world without her. I told her about Priya, not the version I'd been telling myself, which was that we'd simply grown in different directions. The real version, that I had loved her in a way that was careful and consistent and hadn't been wrong, but that I had also spent 2 years adapting myself to what she needed without noticing that it was making me smaller. That when she left, I had felt, underneath the loss, something that took me a long time to name as relief. That had sat badly with me. Mara was quiet for a moment. The candles were low by then. Then she said, "Relief doesn't mean you didn't love her. It just means some part of you already knew." The storm had moved off by the time we went to sleep. I lay in the dark for a while after that, not thinking about anything specific, just aware of the apartment, the way it felt more inhabited than it used to, the way it had become a place where 2 people actually lived rather than a space one person occupied while trying to stop noticing the absence of another. 6 weeks after the storm, she told me she'd had lunch with someone she'd been set up with by a mutual friend. She mentioned it the way you mention something minor, at the kitchen counter, not making eye contact, in the middle of assembling a sandwich. She said it hadn't been bad. She said he seemed straightforward. She said she didn't know yet. I said that sounded like a reasonable starting point. She nodded and took her sandwich back to her desk. I stood in the kitchen for a moment longer than I needed to. Then I washed the knife she'd left in the sink and went back to work. There were 2 more lunches. I know because she mentioned them briefly the same way. I did not ask follow-up questions. I was not exactly sure what I was not asking about. She stopped mentioning them. Then one evening she was at her desk later than usual, and when I looked in to say goodnight, she didn't say it back right away. She said, "He said he wanted something casual." I said I was sorry to hear that. She shrugged. "I wasn't actually surprised," she said, "which tells me something." I asked what it told her. She thought about it for a second. That I was already keeping 1 foot out. I didn't push on that. I said goodnight again and she said it back. I was awake longer than usual that night, not analyzing anything, just awake. It was March when things shifted in a way I couldn't continue not noticing. We'd started watching a documentary series together, Thursday nights, her end of the couch, and mine. It had started accidentally. I'd been watching the first episode when she came in for water and ended up sitting down and staying until the end. And then we just kept going. Somewhere around the 5th week, she'd started arriving with both our mugs already made. I didn't comment on it. She didn't explain it. It was just the way we watch TV now. One Thursday, she fell asleep 15 minutes before the end. I watched the last part quietly. When it finished, I turned the volume down and just sat there for a few minutes. She was tucked into the corner of the couch the way she always sat, except her head had dropped to the side and her hands had loosened around the mug, which was empty. I took the mug carefully. She stirred slightly. Her eyes opened partway. She looked at me the way people look at things when they're still mostly somewhere else. Then she closed them again. I set the mug in the sink, turned off the lamp, said goodnight quietly. She said it back from half sleep, her voice different in that register. Lower, unguarded. I went to my room and lay there thinking about nothing and everything at the same time, which is what happens when you already know something and are still waiting for the right moment to decide you know it. Her parents called back in April, Thomas specifically. I was in my room and could hear the conversation happening in the kitchen, not the words, just the rhythm of it. The first half was careful, a little stiff. Then something loosened in the middle. Then a long silence. When she knocked on my door, she looked tired in a specific way. The kind of tired that follows something difficult that went slightly better than you feared. She sat in the chair I'd cleared from my desk. Her eyes were dry but a little pink at the edges. She said she'd told her father the truth, that there was no one, that she'd panicked on the phone and the visit had been part of an architecture of avoidance she'd been building for too long, that she loved him and she was sorry. Thomas had been quiet for a long time after that. Then he'd asked if she was okay, the real question under the question. She said she thought so. He said he was glad. He said he'd call her mother and they'd talk more next week. Not the explosion I'd prepared for, she said. I said, sometimes people surprise you. She nodded. Thank you, she said, for that afternoon, for making it feel real enough that I could see what I actually wanted. I didn't say anything right away. Then I asked what she meant by that last part. She looked at me steadily. I mean, watching you sit at that table with my father and just be exactly yourself, no performance, it reminded me what that looks like, what it should feel like. I held on to that for a while before I answered. I said I was glad the afternoon had been useful. She nodded once, like that was exactly the answer she expected, and went back to her desk. I sat in my room for longer than I intended. The following 3 weeks were ordinary in every surface-level way. We watched the last 2 episodes of the documentary. The series ended ambiguously, which she liked and I found slightly frustrating, and we talked about it for 20 minutes and didn't agree. She started a new project that had her at her desk at odd hours. I finished a proposal that had been stalling for a month. The apartment breathed around us the way it always did, but I was paying a different kind of attention to things now. The way she'd pause in the middle of the kitchen sometimes and look at whatever was out the window for just a moment before moving on. The way she apologized instinctively when she sneezed too loudly or when her chair scraped the floor. The deep conditioning of someone who had learned early that her presence needed to justify itself. The way she listened. Completely. The kind of listening that makes you think more carefully about what you say because you know it will be received and remembered. I was not rushing toward any conclusion. I was just letting things be accurate. The Sunday it happened, we'd both been home all day. It had rained all morning and cleared in the early afternoon into something pale and still. We'd made lunch separately, crossed paths in the kitchen twice without anything remarkable occurring, and by evening we'd both landed in the living room. She on the couch with her laptop, me at the table with a set of plans I needed to review. The apartment was quiet the way it gets on Sunday evenings, a particular kind of quiet, the kind that knows the week is about to start again and is holding itself still in the last few hours before it does. She closed her laptop around 7:30. I looked up. She stretched her arms above her head and looked at the ceiling for a second. Then she got up, walked to the kitchen, and when I heard her putting the kettle on, I assumed that was all. But she came back to the doorway and stood there for a moment. "Can I tell you something?" she said. I said, "Of course." She came the rest of the way into the room and stood by the table where I was working. "I think I've been making it complicated," she said. I waited. "The thing with Daniel," she said, which was the man she'd had the 3 lunches with. I kept waiting to feel certain. I kept thinking certainty would arrive at some point and I'd know, but it never did. And I think I know why. I asked why. She looked at the plans on the table for a moment, not reading them, just giving her eyes somewhere to land while she figured out how to say the next thing. "Because I was already certain about something else," she said, and I kept not looking at it because it felt complicated. I was very still. "Is it?" I asked. "Complicated?" She finally looked up at me. "I live here," she said, "and you're the most honest person I know. And yes, maybe. But I don't think that's what would make it complicated." The kettle had come to a boil in the kitchen. Neither of us moved to deal with it. I said her name. She waited. I said, "I've been not looking at it too." She held my gaze for another second. Then she crossed the room back toward the kitchen, turned off the kettle, and came back and stood in front of me. "Okay," she said. "Then let's look at it." I reached up and put my hand at the side of her jaw. She didn't move back. The apartment was quiet around us, that specific Sunday evening quiet, and the pale remains of the afternoon were gone now, and the room had the warm, dim quality of early spring evenings when the streetlights are just starting to matter. I stood up. She looked at me the whole time. Then she kissed me the same way she did most things, without second-guessing it, as if she had already thought it through and arrived at the part where she'd decided. I want to tell you something about what comes after that moment, the practical reality of it, because I think we romanticize the falling and don't talk enough about the part where you take stock of what you've built by accident. What we already had was this: 18 months of learning each other's actual rhythms, 18 months of knowing how each other moved through a hard day. I knew that she needed 45 minutes of quiet when she got off a difficult call. She knew I processed things slowly and not to interpret my quiet as distance. I knew the 2 days before a deadline she went very internal and that the best thing was to leave her coffee on the counter and not remark on it. She knew that after a frustrating client meeting I needed to walk somewhere, and she never asked where I was going or why. This is not nothing. This is in fact most of what it takes. What changed was the permissions, the things we'd been quietly not allowing ourselves, the way I could now say the honest thing instead of the measured thing, the way she stopped bracing slightly for the version of me she'd decided to expect. The first Sunday after, she pinned 6 of the postcards to the wall above her desk. I didn't say anything. She didn't explain it. But they were up. Thomas called a month later. He and Claire wanted to come for a long weekend in June. This time when Mara looked at me, there was no architecture of avoidance in it. No apology pre-built into the ask. "Do you want to be here for that?" she said. I said yes. I was there. We had dinner the second night, the 4 of us at the kitchen table with the windows open because it was warm enough for that finally, and Thomas and I talked about urban ecology and the specific problem of green infrastructure in aging cities, and at one point Claire laughed at something and said, "Thomas, let the man eat." He looked at me and said, "She does that." I said I was starting to get the picture. Mara, across the table, looked at her plate, but she was smiling. After they went back to their hotel, we did the dishes together, the windows still open, the night coming in thin and clean. She handed me plates and I stacked them to dry, and neither of us said much for a while. Then she said, "My mother told me in the hallway before dinner that I seemed different." I asked what she said to that. She said she told her she was. I handed the last glass back to her. She set it on the drying rack. Looked at it. "I've been thinking about the postcards," she said. "The ones I pinned up." I said I noticed. I think I wasn't putting them up before, because I was treating them like evidence of all the ways I hadn't gone where I was supposed to, she said. But they're actually just proof that people who love you keep thinking about you even when you're somewhere else. The window was still open. The drying rack was full. I looked at her for a moment. "That's a better reading," I said. She half smiled, the small one that meant she agreed but wasn't going to make a big thing of it. We turned off the light and the kitchen went quiet. There is a specific kind of slow that good things move at when you're not forcing them. Priya had taught me by accident that urgency and feeling are not the same thing, that you can spend years making yourself urgent and still be standing in a room that no longer contains you. Mara never needed me to perform. She needed me to be present. Those are different requirements. I had spent a long time not knowing I was good at the second one because I'd been trying so hard to meet the demands of the first. We still live in the same apartment. The bookshelf still leans 2 degrees to the right. The hallway window still lets in a thin draft in winter. I shimmed the bookshelf again last fall with a better piece of material, and it lasted about 3 weeks before settling back. I've stopped trying. Some things work because of their imperfections, not in spite of them. The postcards are all up now. All of them. The full set, pinned across the wall above her desk in an order that makes sense to her and which I've never asked her to explain. The French press is on the counter next to my coffee maker, and we use both depending on who's making it and how much time there is. She asked me once, early on, why I'd kept the leaning shelf instead of replacing it. I said it was because it had been there long enough to become part of the place. She said, "I think things work like that with people too sometimes." I said I thought so too. She has a better memory for the small moments than I do. She always catches the one detail I left out when we tell this story. I rely on that. If you've stayed here this long, I want to ask you something. Think about the person you've worked the hardest to be right for. The one who made you feel like you were always one adjustment away from being enough. When that ended, what did you feel first? I think the answer tells you something true about whether it was love or effort. And the second thing, have you ever sat across from someone in an ordinary room at an ordinary moment and thought, "Oh, there it is," and then looked away because it felt too close to something you weren't ready to name? Write your answer below. I read all of them. And if this story found you somewhere real, you know what to do. There's a version of this story I used to tell that was shorter and cleaner. It left out the parts that don't resolve neatly, the months where I wasn't sure what I was feeling and wasn't going to say anything until I was, the specific texture of sitting with something important and choosing not to rush it to a conclusion it hadn't earned yet. I used to think that was a flaw in me. The slowness. Priya thought so. She used to say I was the kind of person who would watch a building burn and take notes before calling anyone. She meant it as a criticism. I understand now it was just a difference in language. Some people speak in urgency. I speak in accuracy. I'd rather be slow and right than fast and somewhere that doesn't fit. Mara's version of this. She said the same thing quieter and without the analogy. She said it on the couch one evening while we were watching something neither of us was fully paying attention to, and she said it so plainly I almost missed it. "You take things seriously," she said. "The actual things. Not the performance of things." I asked what the difference was. She thought for a second. "Most people are very good at making things feel real," she said. "You're very good at being real." I didn't answer right away. I let that sit the way it deserved to sit. Then I said, "That might be the most useful thing anyone said to me in a long time." She looked at the screen. "Good," she said, and that was it. That's how most of the important things happen between us. Not with weight and ceremony, with the ordinary room around us and both of us being honest and neither of us making it more than it needs to be. I've thought a lot about why the roommate situation worked in our favor rather than against us. The obvious answer is that it gave us time. 18 months of unscripted proximity before anything was named. But I think it's more specific than that. When you live with someone, you don't see the version of them they assemble for an audience. You see the 7 a.m. version, the version that's just had a difficult call and needs 20 minutes before they can be a person again. The version that stands at the window for no apparent reason and then comes back and makes something hot to drink and gets on with it. You see how they handle inconvenient things, small breakdowns of ordinary life, the recycling bag that splits, the landlord who doesn't call back, the draft that isn't working and won't work and needs to be started over. These are not romantic moments. They are revealing ones. And what I learned watching Mara handle the inconvenient things is this. She was steady in a way that didn't announce itself. She didn't perform composure. She was just composed. And when she wasn't, she was honest about it and didn't ask me to fix it, only to witness it. I could do that. I found I was good at that. Better, actually, than I'd been at most things I'd been asked to do in relationships before. There was an afternoon in November, a few months before everything shifted, when she'd been working on something for 3 days that wasn't landing. I'd watched it without saying anything. On the third day, I came home, and she was at her desk, and she looked up when I walked in and said, "I think I've been solving the wrong problem." I asked what she meant. She said sometimes she got stuck, not because the work was hard, but because she was trying to fix a symptom instead of the cause. She said it was a thing she did, got focused on the surface problem and forgot to look at what was underneath it. I said I did the same thing. She said, "What do you do when that happens?" I said I went outside and walked until the design stopped making sense and then started making a different kind of sense. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "That actually sounds right." She went for a walk. She came back an hour later and worked for another 4 hours straight. The next morning, the piece was done. She set it in my direction across the counter when I came into the kitchen. No context, just the finished printed pages. I read the first 3 paragraphs. Then I looked up. "That's really good," I said. She said, "I know." Not arrogantly, just factually. The way someone says something when they've worked hard for it and they know it and they're not going to pretend otherwise. I liked that about her. I've always liked people who can say they did good work without needing you to argue them into it. The months after we stopped not looking at it were different in texture, but not in kind. We were still us. The apartment was still the apartment. But certain things we'd been careful around stopped requiring the carefulness, and what was underneath turned out to be larger and more settled than either of us had quite calculated for. She told me once in February that she'd been afraid the shift would make the apartment feel different, make the daily mechanics of it feel loaded. I said I'd thought about that too. She said, "But it doesn't." I said, "No, it doesn't." She said she thought it was because we'd both been so slow about it, that by the time it became what it was, we'd already built enough underneath it that there was nothing precarious about it. I thought about that for a while. I thought about the buildings I'd designed that worked well, the ones that lasted, the ones you could stand in during a windstorm and feel the structure absorbing the pressure evenly across every point instead of holding it in one place. The ones that lasted weren't the most dramatic, they were the most considered. The ones where someone had thought about the weight distribution and the load paths, and where the stress would concentrate, and had built accordingly. I think people work similarly. The ones that last aren't the most combustible. They're the ones where both people thought carefully about the weight and built their distribution accordingly. That's what we'd done, accidentally, then deliberately. And somewhere in all that building, it had become load-bearing without our ever having named the moment when it happened. Thomas called in the spring to ask if we'd consider coming to Connecticut for the holidays. Claire, he said, had been cooking in anticipation, and he used the word anticipation with the slightly formal precision of a man who was trying not to make too big a deal of something that was in fact a fairly big deal. Mara said she'd ask me. She came to the kitchen doorway and looked at me the same way she'd looked at me the night she'd come in with her phone in both hands, except this time there was nothing apologetic built into the question before she'd asked it. "Connecticut for the holidays?" she said. I said yes. We went. We are still going. The apartment is full of things that belong to both of us now, in the overlapping way that happens when two people have been building a life in the same space for long enough. A second copy of a book I already owned and she'd brought her own copy of. because neither of us wanted to consolidate to one. A second coffee method that I've been converted to more often than I'd admit. A standing policy about Sunday mornings that we arrived at naturally, and now neither of us would disrupt without good reason. And the postcards, all of them, pinned in their order above her desk. She was right that they were evidence of people who kept thinking of her even when she was somewhere else. And so they were. But they're also evidence of a person who stayed, who unpacked that box fully, eventually, who decided this was the place to actually live in, not just pass through. I didn't patch the spot where the hallway window lets the cold in this winter. I did the thing I always do. I taped the edge, waited, and then stopped before the last step. She noticed. She said, "You're doing the thing again?" I said I knew. She said, "Is this one also a reminder?" I thought about it. "I think this one is just a window," I said. "Some things are just things." She laughed. The real kind, without covering her mouth. That sound. That's what I didn't have a name for a long time. That's what I was collecting.